Bruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Chav Gimel Amud Beis at the very top. Our Mishnah is discussing a karpef, an enclosed area that is not used for residential purposes. The sheet of Rabbi Akiva is that one can metaltil in a karpef, even if it's not made for residential purposes, so long as it's going to be shivim umashu, meaning shivim v'shirayim, 70 and 2/3 by 70 and 2/3 amma. However, if he does make the karpef for residential purposes, then he can have any space, any amount that he would like to enclose. Says the Gemara right away, Rabbi Akiva hainu Tanakama, but that's the sheet of the Tanakama. After all, the first Mishnah in the Perek states that there's a machloikis gabe pasin labeirois. According to the Tanakama, you can have any amount of enclosement when you enclose the water source, because after all, when it comes to the water source, the Chacham Taina, the Tanakama Tainas, that's going to be for residential purposes. That's what people are going to be using the water ultimately to draw it and give to their animals, but it's something that the human beings are going to then have a kavua dika use for. So therefore, here too, what is it in Rabbi Akiva's opinion that you can go ahead and make any amount of enclosure, no matter how great the size of the area is? That's the sheet of the Chachamim. Answers the Gemara, Iga benayu davar muat. There's a small amount that is going to be the difference between the two of them. According to the Tanakama, it's base sosayim, 100 by 50 amos, comes out to be 5,000 square amos. Whereas if according to Rabbi Akiva, it's shivim and 2/3 by shivim and 2/3 amo. Says the Gemara, the Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Dovar muat yesh al shivim amo v'shirayim v'loy nitnu chachamim boy shiur. There is a little amount, they said, that's going to be on top of the amount that we mentioned now as shivim and 2/3. The Chacham didn't give the specific amount. The kamashir, what is the amount that we're talking about? It's based on the following. So sayim kechatzar mishkan, just like the chatzar mishkan has a length of 100 amos and a width of 50 amos, thereby that is going to be what we use for our karpef, that a person can metalta within that amount, which is going to be 5,000 square amos. Menohani mili. Where do we know to say that this rabbinic area called the karpef has an asmachta from the Torah? Omar Yehuda Omar Kro, the pasuk says, orech hachotzer meya be'amo verochav chamishim bechamishim. The length of the chotzer is 100 amos, and the width is 50 amos. Omra Torah, the fact that the Torah states in this way that it's a measurement of 50 amos wideness is chamishim b'chamishim. So the Gemara makes the drasha Amar Torah tol chamishim v'sabev chamishim. Take 50 and then take out the 50 and then go surround that 50. So you'll get ultimately 70 and 2/3. That will then be 70 by 2/3, giving close to the proximity of the 5,000 square amos. Ask the Gemara, Pashte de Kro b'maiksiv. What about the Poshit Pshat of the Pasuk? How do we understand what the Pasuk is saying when it says that it's width of chamishim b'chamishim? Answers the Gemara Marbai to explain, Ha made Mishkan al svas chamishim. Stand up the Mishkan from the edge of the entrance of the area of the Chotzer, of 50 amos, Kadeshi 50 amo lefonov, so that you'll have another 50 amos in front of it. Ve'eshim amo lekol ruach uruach. In other words, the Gemara is saying that if you have the length of 100 amos, so if you take the first 50 amos as the entrance is going to be empty, but after that we'll start another 50 amos, which will then have the Mishkan inside of it, which contains the menorah, the lechem haponim, even the golden mizbeach, as well as the Aron HaKodesh, and that will be situated in the middle of this 50 amos length, and it'll have 20 amos, it'll have Yes, 20 amos on both sides, because it itself is going to be a width of 10 amos. The Gemara now quotes the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, that Rabbi Eliezer says, Im haisa orka, if the length of this karpef is going to be, the Mishnah says, greater than the width, even by 1 amma, then he says, you cannot metaltal in it. Ask the Gemara v'hatanya. Rabbi Eliezer oimer im haisa orka yeser al pishnayim kiroch berochva afilu amma achaz emetaltim besoicha. Here the Brisa states in the name Rabbi Eliezer that if you have a rectangle of twice the length than the width, then that is fine, so long as it's not going to be more than an amma. That the length will be not more than an amma, more than twice the width. Whereas our Mishnah quotes Rabbi Eliezer stating that it has to be a square. Omer Rabbi bar Abaye, kitnan nami masnisin yeser al pishnayim berochvatnan. Rabbi bar Abaye explains that you have to explain Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah like the Brisa, that it means to say that you can have, again, the orech, the length, to be doubled more than the roichav, the width, but not more than an amma doubled. Yehochi asked the Gemara, if that's the case, and that's what Rabbi Eliezer is saying, Hainu Rabbi Yosi, this is the sheet of Rabbi Yosi, who says, again, that it can be a length that is doubled than the width. Ika benayu ribua de ribua rabbanon. The difference between them is the square. In other words, according to the sheet of Rabbi Yosi, the way it's stated in the Mishnah, his opinion states, Omer Rabbi Yosi oimer afilu arka pishnayim berochba metaltalin besoicha, means even if it's going to be a rectangle where the length will be doubled than the width, meaning to say that it's preferable to have a square karpef. But b'di'evet, if it's going to be a rectangle, that's also good. Even that will be then permissible to carry within it. Whereas according to the Shita of Rabbi Eliezer, he does not make a differentiation between whether it's squared or whether it's rectangle. They're both equally good. The Gemara now quotes Rabbi Yosi, as we just said now, says that you can have the length to be double than the width. Says the Gemara, Itmar, Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Halacha Rabbi Yosi. The halacha is indeed like Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Bibi, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, halakha Rabbi Akiva. The halakha is like Rabbi Akiva. It's like Rabbi Yosi who says that it can be rectangle, and it's like Rabbi Akiva that says that if you are going to make it for residential purposes, then you can have any amount, any area that you want to encircle. It's only if you don't make it for residential purpose that you can have only a size of shivim v'shirayim al shivim v'shirayim. V'travai lekula, and they're both quoted here as the halacha lekula. V'tzrichim, we need both of them. The iyashma'in in halacha Rabbi Yosi, that if we only were taught the halacha is like Rabbi Yosi, hava mina adi ika shoymira oy beis dira, I might think that that's only going to be true that you can have a rectangular shaped karpef if it's going to be made for residential purposes. Kamash malan halacha Rabbi Akiva, the halacha Rabbi Akiva, that even if it was not made for residential purposes, you can go ahead and still carry within that area. Only if it's going to be residential purpose, Rabbi Akiva says you can have even greater than that area. V'yashmin halach Rabbi Akiva, if I would say that the halach Rabbi Akiva havamina der orich v'katin loy, I would think that length and narrowness not, in other words, it cannot be rectangular, it has to be squared. Kamash malon halach Rabbi Yosi, that it can be even rectangular. So we have both, the halach like both of them to explain that it can be both rectangle and it doesn't have to be made for residential purposes. And if it will be made for residential purposes, then you can have any area that you want to encircle. The Gemara now brings about a karpef. Says the following: Shehu yoiser mi beis sosayim, if it's greater than the size of beis sosayim, 2 saw. Shehu kaf ledira, and it's enclosed for residential purposes. So let's say you have a situation where you have 3. A karpef of 3 sosayim, maybe altogether we'll say it's 5 sosayim, and you have 3 of those sosayim that you're going to then, that you encompass, that you close over and enclose for residential purposes. Nizra ruboy harehu kegina va'oser. If the roiv, if the 3 saw, which is greater than the 2, because we have an area of 5 saw, if that 3 saw is going to be then planted a garden, then it's also to metaltil. Nota ruboy harehu kechatzer mutar. However, if you plant trees, then it doesn't disturb the residency, the area where they're living, and therefore it still has the din as a residential area, and therefore it's mutar metaltil. So again, if he planted roiv, so then it changes its status from that which was initially enclosed as a residential area, and therefore you could have metaltil in the whole area. And now, because it is going to be planted for garden, it loses its status as a residential area, and therefore you cannot metaltil in that area, because now we're talking about more than 2 sosayim, and more than 2 sosayim was not made for residency. You cannot go ahead and metaltil, like we just said, the halacha is Rabbi Akiva. Nizra ruboy, if the majority is planted, we said, Omar Rav Huna bar Reid Rabbi Yoshua lo yamarn ela yoiser mi beis sosayim. He makes a point of saying, we're talking about when it's greater than 2 saw, like the case that we just explained, when it's 3 saw in a total area of 5 saw, then it's prohibited to carry in that area. Aval beis sosayim mutter. But if it is 2 saw, then it is mutter, because then you have the 2 saw, which is permitted in a non-residential area of a karpef. And the chiddush that he's saying over here is the other area that is not planted. So that if you have over here 2 saw that's planted and 3 saw, and let's say it's now, we have to change the measurements to be, let's say, a total of 3 saw together, and it's 2 saw that's planted and 1 saw that is not planted. So then you can not only can you walk in within the karpef, but you can also walk to the chotzer, which is adjacent, that has not been planted. The non-planted, the unplanted area does not combine with the karpef. Kiman, who is this light that says you can go ahead and carry not only in the area of the 2 sosayim, which is a karpef, but also from the karpef to the chotzer, or vice versa, from the chotzer back to the karpef? Says the Gemara, Rabbi Shimon, this is the sheet of Rabbi Shimon. We know when it comes to a chotzer and a bias, if a person wants to carry from a bias to a chotzer or vice versa, the Chachamim enacted Eruv Chatzeros. They were concerned that if we permit somebody to carry from a bias to a chotzer or vice versa without an Eruv, one may also carry in the Rishus HaRabim. So therefore, they said you have to make an Eruv Chatzeros. What about an area that is outside? An outside area, do we say that also requires, does that permit you to then walk from one area that's outside to another area outside? For example, a chotzer and a karpef. If it's owned by the same person, the Chacham said it's not similar enough to then say that one can carry from the chotzer to the karpef, and they prohibited the carrying of the 2. However, Rabbi Shimon is the opinion that they are similar enough, and one can, yes, carry from the karpef to the chotzer and vice versa. As follows, this nan, it stays in the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon Omer, echad gagois ve'echad chatzeros ve'echad karfifois, reshus achas hein lekelim, sheshavsu b'soichon, v'lo lekelim sheshavsu b'soich habayis. Here it says in the Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon says that when you have these all outside areas, owned by the same person, one can, yes, carry from the karpef to the chotzer or vice versa, or the gag to the chotzer and vice versa, because these are all similar areas, and therefore, so providing that the object that you're carrying from the chotzer, let's say, to the karpef, was already in the chotzer on the onset of Shabbos, and you can go ahead and carry it. However, it was in the bayis, and then was brought to the chotzer, you cannot carry to the karpef, because essentially what you're doing is carrying from the bayis to the chotzer via, or the karpef via the chotzer. So therefore that's prohibited. Ask the Gemara about the Rabbi Shimon Nami, even if you're going to say Rabbi Shimon, who permits you to carry from a karpef to a chotzer, but in this case where we have 3 saw of karpef, 2 of them originally were all three of them were encircled for residential purposes, then two of those three saw were then planted. So says the Gemara, if that's the case, even Rabbi Shimon would say that you cannot go ahead and metaltel in that area. Why? Says the Gemara, Kivan de Nizra Ruboy have hau meutoi botil le legabe rubo. Because since you planted the roiv of this karpef, two out of the three saw were planted, and now it reverts back to an non-residential area, then that two saw will then mevatil the third saw, and therefore the third saw will also then no longer have the status as being a residential area. So therefore it would come out that even Rabbi Shimon would prohibit being metaltal in that area. Then you would have a karpef that is now more than two saw, it would be three saw, and you cannot carry within that area that's not residential, which is a karpef beyond two saw. So we're on top of Chav Dalet Amud Aleph, reading from the second line now. So therefore the Gemara is saying that Rabbi Shimon would also agree in such a scenario. Again, if it's a three saw area that was originally encircled with a fence around it for a purpose of residential area, but since two of them were planted, it loses its status as being a residential area, not only for the two saw, but even the third saw, which is mevata the third saw. So it comes out that you have a three saw area that is enclosed as a karpef, that is for non-residential purposes. You cannot metaltal in it. Says the Gemara, Eli itmar hachi itmar. But if you want to say that what he was saying before, you can say the following. Ha mi'uta shar. We're making a diuk. You're right. If it's the roiv, then even Rabbi Shimon would agree that you cannot metaltal in it, as we just explained. But the diuk is, but if it's a miut, going back to the case that we said before, that let's say you have a situation where you have, let's say, three saw and one saw, or let's say five saw, make it easier for the hemshech. If you have five saw and you only have two saw that is going to be planted, let's explain. That's going to be mutter as a mute. Explains the Gemara. So we have to change the scenario now and say that it's a five saw area, but one saw was planted as a garden. So you had originally a five saw that was enclosed for residential purposes. One saw was planted for a garden. That one saw, therefore, is losing its status as being a residential area and now a non-residential area. Aval beis sasayim osir. But if it's two saw, then it will be osir. It will be prohibited. Kiman, kirabban. This is like the rabbanon, because if you have two saw, according to the rabbanon, then it has chashivus. And therefore that two saw will make it so then that two saw is a karpef. And according to the Chacham, you cannot carry from a karpef to a chotzer or vice versa. And therefore, only if it's one saw that you planted, that would be permitted, because that one saw doesn't have chashivus, and therefore it's considered to be batil to the other four saw, and you can go ahead and carry within that whole area of five saw. But according to the Chacham, if it's two saw, that two saw is substantial, has chashivus, as a base saw, and therefore that would be a base saw that is something that's different than the residential area next to it, and therefore you cannot carry from the karpef to the chotzer, or vice versa. Rabbi Yirmiyahu medifti masni lekula. He taught this lekula. Ha mi'uta shari. We make the same diuk. Again, if it was the roiv that was planted, then it's mevatel the miut, and everything according to Rabbi Shimon would also be prohibited. But we're talking about a case where it's a miut that he planted. So if it's the miut that he planted of the five saw, and he planted one saw, or even two saw, let's say, so it's going to be mutter. Explains the Gemara. Amar Rav Huna Bredi of Yoshua, lo yamran ela beis sasayim. We're talking about if he planted two saw of the five saw, and it's a miut of the five saw, so two saw itself would be permissible to carry in. But if it would be three saw, or more than two saw, a little bit more than two saw, wouldn't be, let's say, even the majority, even maybe a minority, but still is more than two saw, then it will be prohibited. Kiman ke Rabbi Shimon. This is the sheet of Rabbi Shimon. Again, going back to the sheet of Rabbi Shimon, that when Rabbi Shimon says, first of all, if it's up to 2 saw, then you can carry within it because it's a regular 2 saw that's within a karpef, even if it's non-residential, you can carry within it. So it's a classical karpef. And also the other area is residential, even though it's beyond 2 saw, you can carry within that too. It's a chotzer. And the chiddush is that Rabbi Shimon is saying that you can go ahead and carry from one to the other, from the karpef to the chotzer, and vice versa. So this is now 2 different ways of explaining this statement. Either the way according to the Rabbanon, that say that you cannot carry from one chotzer to a karpef or vice versa. So therefore, if it's 1 saw, it would be fine because it would be nisbatel to the other area, as we explained before. But if it was 2 saw, not, because you cannot carry from one to the other. Whereas if it's going to be the sheet of Rabbi Shimon and it's 2 saw, you could go ahead and carry from one to the other and vice versa. But if it's more than 2 saw, then it would be prohibited because after all, more than 2 saw is an area that's going to be something that you cannot metaltal in since it's for non-residential purposes. And that's the shita of Rabbi Shimon.